So I'm thrilled to be here today to talk to you about the modern motivators of play and other things. But we're going to explore the wide world of game design, game development, and how all of that interacts with human-computer interaction. But when I was working on the sort of organization of the game development strategy guide, it was really important to me that it start with player behavior
Mm,
before we get to anything like business or monetization, because it feels like it's jumping to a solution before identifying the problem. And I'd seen that in industry, right? Like games that didn't have a connection to why players play. And so that's the first question is, do you really know why people play your game? It's surprising how much we as an industry take for granted as game developers regarding what players want. Many assumptions are based on out of date or partial understanding. The games the players want now are not the games they wanted 20 years ago. And that can be hard for those of us who have been around this long to like really come to terms with. So, and if you don't know what motivates your players to keep playing your game, how do you know you're making the right decisions? We see it all the time in app design. And like I was just like looking at Blue Sky today and reflecting on the fact that the carousel came and went 24 hours, right? Like if we don't know what motivates people and how they're using our apps, we can stumble into challenges. So we're going to talk about what a motivator is, where do they come from in this context. I'm going to present 9 motivators of play to you, and then we're going to get into some things, a discussion of how UX design relates to game design, and get into some techniques. And in the technique section, I'm going to share some late breaking insights from my teaching of my course over at Carnegie Mellon, which third session wrapped just last week. So what's a motivator? A motivator of play is one of the core psychological needs that a player seeks to fulfill when choosing to play a game of any kind. They can be conscious or unconscious, and players may have one or more at a time per game. A single game may serve multiple motivators, and most do. Where do they come from? There are a number of different sources, and there is no definitive list of motivators. I've come up with one that works really well for my class and that I feel aligns really well with the research I've seen. But there's also a number of companies out there that will charge you very good money to go and come up with a proprietary list of motivators. And so, but Ralph Koster's A Theory of Fun has been around for a long time, and it was really one of the first times we really started talking about player motivation at sort of an industry-wide level. And there was a lot of time exploring the subjective concept of fun, but from a chemical level, which was very helpful, right? Turning it from just vibes to like why we chase the vibes. But mastery and competition were also explored as key drivers of human behavior there. In The Gamer's Brain, Celia Hodent explores the fundamentals of motivation. We, as user experience designers, as human-computer interaction specialists, you're all familiar with extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, so I don't really need to go into that terribly much. But Celia also explores self-determination theory, which features 3 fundamental needs that can explain player behavior: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And these sort of branch out into some of the specific motivators we see in gameplay, like cooperation, competition, self-expression, mastery, etc. In the first episode of my podcast, Enduring Play, which is the companion to my book, I got to talk to Celia, who was the former experience design director for Fortnite during its early days. And it's a really good list, and I'm not going to drain the lake on the whole episode. But, one of the really interesting insights is how they went from sort of 1 versus 100 to squad mode, and how intentional that choice was to really move from just the competitive motivator to servicing the companionship motivator as well. So you're not just competing, but you're also connecting with your friends. Now, there are lots of other taxonomies out there too. Richard Bartle's taxonomy of player types comes up a lot in game design. And, some of these things I feel like are fading a little bit, like the killers piece. Like it's still there, right? Call of Duty exists, but is it really the killing that's motivating, or is it something else? Is it the mastery? Is it's something there? But what's interesting is to look at the axes that a lot of these different frameworks use. That even in the 90s, multiplayer versus world interaction, like single player interaction was driving these player archetypes, which is really instructive. And interaction versus unilateral action gets to the depth of gameplay versus singular track gameplay, which is really interesting. About a decade later, John Radoff in his book Game On was observing that model was not scaling and changed it. the multiplayer aspect is still here. And so that's, it's still very strong driver of changes in motivator profiles. But what's interesting here is the other axis switches to the method of winning, method of communicating winning. But what I think is really interesting here is it assumes that the game has a win state. Does The Sims have a win state? Does Flower have a win state? And so like this too, like 2011, gaming was in a much different place than it is now. And so the gaming continues to evolve. So this, I think, was probably very reflective of the game industry at the time, but does it reflect where we are now? But there's some new concepts here: immersion, cooperation, competition shows up again, and achievement. These are just some of the many frameworks, right? There's no way I could list all the different people doing scholarship in this space. These are just a few of them, and I couldn't even fit all these into the chapter. My editor would have, poor Marta. I am very long-winded, but so let's talk about the 9 motivators of play that I put out in my first chapter, and these started as a tool for my Carnegie Mellon class for the Masters of Entertainment Industry Management class, which is a class for students who aspire to potentially be leaders in the game development space, but many of them don't necessarily have experience in game development. And I have seen as a game developer how that lands, right? And so I wanted, but you have 12 hours. What are you going to do with that? So I wanted something that would be easy to remember, easy to kind of turn around like a Rubik's Cube and keep with you. And that's where we kind of went. So I've divided the motivators of play into classic and modern. So the classic motivators of play have been around for a while. We see them in some of the older frameworks: fun, mastery, competition, immersion, meditation, and comfort. These don't really depend on specific technologies. Obviously fun has been around since the dawn of time, and mastery, like most sporting competition, these things, most sporting events demonstrate these things. And things like meditation and comfort come up a lot because they seem similar. And Claire, it's a great question a lot of students bring me when I gave talks early in the book tour. And the difference I give people is meditation is the clinical benefit. It's when you really kind of transcend to like, there's the association between Tetris and preventing formation of traumatic memories, versus comfort, which is a lot more subjective. It's vibes. I like Mario, so I'm going to play more Mario, right? And it has and so the much broader purview than the meditation category. Often they're seen together, of course. And then immersion, which it covers a lot of ground, from wide exploration games to VR. It doesn't have to be VR to narrative. There's a lot there. And what qualifies as immersion has changed over time as standards change. But for a while, text-based games felt immersive because that was the most we had. But broadband and smartphones further changed what constitutes good gaming. Players have new expectations forged by highly responsive, constantly updated, massively multiplayer worlds, constantly at the ready in the palm of our hands. And that's how we get to the 3 modern motivators of play: self-expression, companionship, and education. All 3 of these motivators rely mostly on broad scale of either player base or data that wasn't really possible 15, 20 years ago. There were small pockets of it, right? Like self-expression was absolutely a factor when I was working on The Sims in the early aughts, but it wasn't, like, it hadn't become an industry force yet, right? It was just, it took me a while to realize that I was lucky enough with my first internship being The Sims Making Magic, the last Sims 1 expansion pack, to see like the birth of this. So it always just seemed obvious to me, like, play is about self-expression. I didn't realize that other people hadn't seen that from that side of the evolution yet. And so when Minecraft and things came up, I was like, oh, obviously, but it was a surprise to everyone else who hadn't been in there since the beginning. And then, of course, companionship, again, like being a Xennial and being on bulletin boards, I'm like, yeah, that tracks. But not everybody had seen digital experiences as a viable place to have a third space. And so this has really been a transition. And education, I remember my Encarta DVD, I really liked it. But like now these experiences are at scale, and there are a lot. Education's interestingly subjective, right? Like education can be like book learning, or it can be preparing you for a real world experience. I was just interviewing the folks from Backyard Sports for one of my podcast episodes. They were talking about how there's demonstrated evidence that their experiences prepare kids to play sports in the real world, which is educating them on something. But how much has really changed? Aren't players still seeking competitive, mastery-driven experiences? Not as much as you think. So, according to Fandom's Inside Gaming 2024 study of 5,000 gamers globally cross-referenced across their platform data, the results might surprise you. And this is where people, if I'm in a big venue, they start to take the cameras out and start taking pictures, because like, look at competition. 18% of players self-reported being motivated by competition when playing. And that, but I hear Disney Imagineers being like, all gamers want competition. No. Factually untrue. Maybe true 10, 20 years ago. That is not what they're telling us today. What they are telling us is that 40% of them want community, want connection. 50% of them want stress relief. But you know what's not stress relieving? Competition. You know what doesn't relieve stress? Losing. And so if you're coming at these games that way, it shifts what experiences you want. And the world is on fire. I don't know if you've noticed. And so that is having a profound effect on what people are looking for. And then there's this creation, imagination, and self-expression situation, which is increasing significantly year over year. The 2023, the previous year was 10% less. So that's when it's like just leaping up. And that's because the platform is catching up. The platforms are catching up with people's desires. Suddenly you can create anything. And that gives you amazing autonomy, amazing agency. And so it suddenly starts to satisfy a lot of different things. So this, I could spend a ton of time here. Like meditation and comfort are big in an overwhelmingly stressful world. But why so many PvP games if only 18% of players want them? And recent studies continue to align with these trends. The Entertainment Software Association's Power of Play study in 2025, 24,000 people surveyed around the world. Around education, 50% reported video games improved their education or career path. 50%. There's not even that many video games that like align to career paths. That's pretty wild when you think about it. That means that there's indirect benefit, that there's other things like, but then I think about the conversations I have on my podcast and how many people tell me that they learned leadership from their World of Warcraft guild. And then it doesn't seem so weird. 54% of players reported sports games improved real-world athletic skills. 43% say video games influenced their career and education in a positive way. And suddenly you're like, oh, okay, companionship, education, self-expression. Oh, education, like all these things start to fall into place. And there are also a number of growing, like sort of a body of literature around the improvement in cognitive skills from engaging with games. So some people know the gaming makes them better, but don't have a language for how the gaming makes them better. And recently, Boston University, just this year, released a study, much smaller scale, of course, but just under 350 undergraduate and graduate students, but 64% of their respondents used video games as a method of coping with stress. And so again, and what was really interesting here is like language, they're not citing my book, but the language comes up real consistently, immersive tendencies, and things like that, social interaction and companionship, there's a lot here that aligns, whether we're using the same words or not. We've got comforting, we've got the immersion of story, and we've got the companionship of social interaction, and there's a lot here. People are using games in different ways than they were before. So if players are playing more for stress relief and self-soothing, more stressful forms of play like competition and to some people mastery would see corresponding drops in addressable audience. It seems like we as a game industry are not in sync with today's player needs. possibly not enough of calming and meditative games, cooperative games, companionship, community, and social experiences, intellectually stimulating games, passive time-killing games, and too much of competitive, complex, time-demanding, or mastery-focused games. Now, this is not to say that those experiences are invalid, and it's not to say that there are not people who enjoy those games. And it's not to say that those games are unsalvageable either. Like if you can layer on a new, like if you go back to the Fortnite example, right? It was 1 versus 100. They added companionship and that blew it up, right? And it has the self-expression element of being able to do your own thing. And it's suddenly that thrives. And so the question becomes, how might you think about your players differently? And can your existing game support a new motivator? If you are making a game that's targeting the right-hand side of that slide, what motivator might you also support that slides it a little bit more left so that your addressable audience keeps you thriving? How might your game studio best serve the unmet needs reflected in these current trends? How might you make sure that you're not a stressor, but that you are helping relieve stress? And look, this is an art form. You can do whatever you want, but a lot of the pain in the game industry right now is people are like, why so many layoffs? Why so many games failing? Why so many live service games failing? Well, a lot of the live service games that have failed have been targeting the same audience. They are competitive mastery-based games. And the games that come out that don't hit that market are thriving. And if you don't know where to start, one place to start is pro-social gaming. The Thriving in Games group is a consortium of passionate gamers from a variety of game studios, indie through AAA, who have come together to create free, $0 resources on crafting video games that encourage positive social interactions. They've also partnered with the Sesame Workshop to bring these insights to kids. So digitalthrivingplaybook.org, thrivingin-games.org, like this stuff, like it's amazing to me that people sleep on this stuff. When I see games that aren't hitting industry standards on socials and they've not looked at this stuff, I'm like, you do not need to reinvent the wheel. Like this is the Riots and the Blizzards of the world and the people who work at them documenting what they've learned in ways that don't violate NDAs and give you a way to start with a rocket instead of from ground zero. So this is a fantastic way to address the fact that people are looking for connection and companionship without having to start from scratch and solve all the problems about like disruptive behavior. If this is something that interests you, a second episode of my podcast, Enduring Play, I talk with Carlos Figueiredo, who is the co-founder of the Thriving in Games group and also the director of Trust and Safety for Mojang Studios, the company behind Minecraft. And so we talk about the definition of pro-social behavior, which is something that's actively contributing to a thriving community. And it's a hopeful message because Carlos worked on Club Penguin, which often gets a lot of like positive vibes, and then moved on to Minecraft. And when we think about social communities, we often think about disruptive behavior. The Thriving in Games group prefers disruptive to toxic because disruptive is constructive. We can mention it. We have a framework for it, whereas toxic is kind of vibey, hard to say. And it also, toxic implies intent, where the intent for disruption is not always there, but the impact is there. So disruptive behavior is a clearer way to talk about the way these behaviors show up in the community. But the whole point of the Thriving in Games group is to help you design your games to encourage the good behavior, to reward the good behavior, so you never get the disruptive behavior in the first place. If you're only reacting, then the disruptive behavior happens. It causes harm. It causes the sadness. It causes the stress. But there are known ways to create communities that sort of go in a different direction. And Carlos talking about Minecraft is like most of the interactions align with the intent of the game. It is not mostly disruptive. It is mostly aligned. So press record in your brain and keep these motivators handy before we move on to the next set of content. Use these as a razor when making game design decisions or interaction design decisions if you want to apply these. I've given talks where I talk about how to apply these to general design. And these are in the first chapter of my book, which is available for free on rosenfeldmedia.com on the book's website. So if you you can go and get them today, and then you'll have the slides. So this is freely accessible for you. I know being a student can be hard and books can be expensive. And then of course you can always ask for the book to be at a library or something if you want to reference it. But the 6 classic motivators of play: fun, mastery, competition, immersion, meditation, and comfort. The 3 modern motivators of play: self-expression, companionship, and education. Now, academic to academic, educator to educator. Do I think that this is the one true list of motivators? No, because they were different 10 or 20 years ago. And I think that there will probably be a second edition of this book at some point where this evolves. Like, I think that there's some interesting threads when I talk to my students around like agency and exploration. Like, I don't know if those would split out. And I'm interested to partner with academics or researchers to see if I could get enough signal to see, like, do some of these merge? Is there a 10th one? Like, but this is a pretty good starting point. This is pretty good, and it covers a lot of ground. And then it starts good discussions. And as I tell a lot of my directs, and as I tell a lot of people I mentor, like, hey, if you start the right discussions and then you iterate, at least that was a lot of the work right there. So fun, mastery, competition, immersion, meditation, comfort, self-expression, companionship, and education. So what's it like to teach these? I launched the motivators in my first quarter of What Makes Us Play, the Craft of Video Gaming, an MBA class I designed for aspiring video game leaders who might not have existing game design experience. And based on the success of that first class, I pitched the game development strategy guide. So this is my cohort from this year. Hi, friends. And what I found, especially this year, now that I have the book and I've refined things, is that teaching the motivators can change student relationships with their own gaming, which is really exciting. You know, one of the quotes that like really hit me was, I enjoyed your class so much and it made me realize I game more than I thought. I've actually started playing more games to relax at the end of the long days since learning about motivators and thinking about my own taste. So thank you. Like, I was really excited about this because I went on a similar journey documenting the motivators myself, because like I am in gaming. And so there's this like perception of like, oh, you got to play the big games, play the 100-hour open world games and everything. And as I started looking through the motivators, I recognized the self-soothing behavior in myself and gave myself space for it alongside all of the other gaming. And I think the more we do of this, the more we open the door to a more inclusive gaming community. And the more people will self-identify as gamers, the bigger the market gets, the less we have layoffs, right? Like, the point is we want to embrace, and well, there's so many people who say like, oh, I'm not a gamer. And then they'll list like their 5 favorite games and tell me how they just went and bought a Game Boy. And like, I'm like, you are a gamer, but how did we get there, right? And so listing the motivators helps people understand themselves, look at their behavior, and, you know, connecting to emotion. That Jesse Shell's book does a great job of this as well, right? So whether you're teaching game design itself, or you're teaching the motivators, it helps students reflect on their own relationship with gaming. And so when I have them, I do a quiz for evaluating the students' understanding earlier in the class, and then we do a case study later in the class. And one of the case studies this year that really hit me was this emotional economy of webkins. First of all, I had not been exposed to webkins. And so I'm like, wait, there's a live service game with stuffed animals that's been around for 2 decades? Like, well, okay, tell me more. But also like the groundedness is somebody getting up there and telling me like how, like, I love, like, we're defying gender norms. I've got this gentleman telling me how much these stuffed animals meant to him in his childhood, and you know, and reflecting on it and saying like, now that I look at the motivators, it made me care. Like, it turned my routine into something meaningful. And like this really really touched me when this student was working on their case study. So we'll talk a little bit about some other case studies later on, but let's shift gears and talk about game design and user experience, because we've got some human computer interaction going on here. And as somebody who has been a UX director and in games, the interview question that comes up a lot is like, so how do those two things relate? So the way I describe this when I talk to folks is, you know, if you're in a smaller studio, it might be the same person, right? Because it is all designed for humans in the end. But if you are at a studio that's differentiated, game designers are functional experts in designing systems and affordances that shape and guide player behavior over time to desired outcomes, with an intentional ramp of difficulty to keep players growing and engaged. Whereas user experience designers are typically specialized, if in a world where you're hyper specialized, in understanding and optimizing for human perception and cognition as they relate to interactive systems. So the pivot is friction. The game designers are using friction intentionally as a design tool. The user experience designers are out here trying to remove the unintended friction in favor of maximizing comprehension and satisfaction with systems and experiences. But if you don't have clarity on that, User experience designers can seem threatening to game designers because game designers are like, but my friction, that's the whole point. And so you have to figure out how to clearly convey, like, I am getting rid of the unnecessary friction so that the good friction can come out. We've all had experiences where we've played games and we're like, this inventory management sucks. I don't like this. I wanted to go have a powerful experience and go throw magic at some enemy, but I'm here going boop, boop, boop. That's the unintentional friction we need to get rid of. We have to understand the core of the game, get it out of the way, get the unintentional stuff out of the way so the game designers can put the good friction in. User experience in games, there's because games are so large, so complex, we're putting a movie and a cloud service together. I say that all the time on the podcast. It's a little hyper differentiated. We have user experience designer. We often have a user interface artist who is differentiated from that role. User experience researcher, often different. And there's even a technical UX designer often, which is different than those things, and is doing the like hooking up tools or doing the initial implementation in Unity, but not like maybe the refined visuals. It depends on how big your game is, and like the bigger the studio, the more refined the roles get. So as game researchers and designers, how do we evaluate the motivators of play and play? So in the guide, I talk about some new concepts I put in to help me with some of the conversations I was having in class. Two of them are, I love a good 2x2 graph, right? Like, you know, you saw those in Bartle's sort of model earlier. And I had one of those in my first book, Design Beyond Devices, for the spectrum of multimodality. I'm like, why don't we just put some more spectrums in here? Let's go. And so gaming graphics and game monetization are two places where it's helpful to have a nuanced discussion. And so I'm going to walk you through those. And then there are some existing frameworks that I also want to draw some attention to that help us have more nuanced conversations about games. So let's talk about graphics. Why do people get so upset when their favorite game is just on the Switch? How do we move the industry past a single model of good graphics? So in chapter 8, I talk about the spectrum of gaming graphics, an objective tool for categorizing and evaluating games based on conscious aesthetic choices made on appearance so that we can compare like to like. Because there are some games, and there are entire studios now, that intentionally are not doing high fidelity graphics for a variety of reasons. And yet some people will get frustrated that games are not like Spider-Man 2. And so we need to differentiate these things a little bit. We need a language. And so this is my proposal, where we have these two axes. The horizontal axis is how closely the aesthetic is intentionally mimicking reality, and the vertical is the complexity of the visuals. So if you have an aesthetic that's trying to mimic reality but doing so in a low fidelity way, we have a model for that in art. It's called impressionism. Whereas if you are like trying to model reality pixel by pixel, that is, congratulations, you are being realistic, but that costs sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, and so it's not for everybody. Whereas some games, reality doesn't matter at all. You could do whatever you want. You could be super abstract. And then there's the classic aesthetic. I intentionally did not choose retro here because I have seen more and more games that choose in this moment to be low fidelity, to be pixelated, and it's not about pointing us towards the past. It's a choice about the present. It's either it was cheaper to develop, or it was cozy, or it just felt good, like, you know, vibes, whatever. It's classic. It's timeless. It doesn't burn. It doesn't melt your phone. So some recent graphic examples, realistic NBA 2K6 kind of looks like a photo. You know, they're nailing that realistic aesthetic. Clair Obscur is a little bit more on the spectrum, a hybrid of artistic and realistic, right? They look like real people, but there's some other stuff going on, and, you know, various visual effects. Where down here, Old Skies and Anne Roger are mimicking the real world, but in a very low fidelity way. Like they're dropping a lot of detail to just focus on the key elements. And so they are impressionistic in my sort of world. Meanwhile, up in the upper left, we have these games just, they have nothing to do with reality. The Moonlight Walk it literally looks like claymation. It might actually be claymation. It's just like fantastical, amazing. And then Sunderfolk over here as well. And then we have classic. This game is of the dimensions that could probably be shipped on an old school handheld. It's has no text. But it's really well designed. The game sort of teaches you as it goes. It has a modern game design sensibility, and it continues. But it's very much of the now. So let's move on to monetization. What does pay to win even mean? You're not paying for victory, you're paying for power. And what about games that mix monetization models? Because there's actually quite a lot of nuance going on in the industry right now. That's where the spectrum of game monetization comes in. An objective tool for categorizing and evaluating games based on the conscious monetization choices made when designing the game, which might not fall into clean binaries. Now, I know this feels businessy, but this is a game design discussion. It is a human computer interaction design discussion, because the axis here on the horizontal axis is the extent that the monetization is tied to gameplay. And so that's going to drive behavior. It's going to, like, if your monetization is directly tied to benefiting gameplay, that is going to have a huge impact on how people perceive the game, on how they perceive each other, on how they perceive fairness. And that is how you end up with people saying it's pay to win. If somebody can walk in after 5 minutes and buy the most powerful unit in the game and knock you down after playing for a year, that is why they call it pay to win. Versus pay to express on the other side. The entire League of Legends monetization model, for the most part, is pay to express, where you're paying for skins. You don't have to pay to play. You can play for free. And if you decide that you want to express yourself, you can go buy a skin or a bunch of skins. And so that drives behavior in a different way. On the top side, it's about sort of access to the game. It's, pay to play is the traditional model. I bought a cartridge and now I can play that cartridge. And the most pure pay to play model is everybody gets exactly the same experience. I pay and I get a binary and everybody gets the same one. Pay to accelerate, we see a lot with energy, or skipping levels, like it boosts, XP boosts, things like that. So you're technically getting the same game as everybody, but you might get to the end faster. You might get to not have to grind as much. And so that starts to feel unfair to some people, but it's exchange of money for services, and somebody does have to pay for the servers. But it gets very nuanced. And so the vertical axis is the extent of multiplayer gameplay, with single player at the top and player versus player at the bottom. And, like player versus environment is basically in the middle. When you have a single player environment, your monetization choices don't really affect other people. The things you monetize, you could charge people microtransactions in a pay to play game, and it's not going to affect other people's gameplay. So if I charge you, even if I charge you for a really powerful sword in like an online in a RPG, if it's single player, it's still not going to put us in pay for power necessarily. It's really accelerating my game, like my progression through the game. It's not giving me power over other people. But once people start showing up, once I start competing, then it is power over other people, that exchange of money for services. And so that's why, and then the power of expression becomes more potent the more people who are there to see it. And so that's why pay for express is down at the bottom, right? Like it's self-expression in a vacuum. What is it? Like some people have that intrinsic motivation, but most of the time it requires an audience for people to want to go to self-express, to do those things. Some people, like The Sims didn't, some people played The Sims and enjoyed the self-expression just doing it, but there was also, people would jump through a lot of hoops to post screenshots and things like that to the internet and tell stories. So that's why, pay to express, there's a spectrum of there, but the multiplayer aspect or the community aspect matters. So this was the first year I added the spectrum of game monetization to the class quiz. Last year, because it was in development, I kind of was like, hey, this is a beta, this is a thing I'm working on, but I'm not going to test you on it. But it had a whole year of me running around talking about it. And it was the most polarizing question. Some students nailed it, but a lot of students struggled with it. And so as an experiment, I sent students who lost point on that question, chapter 11 of my book, because it's not required that they buy the book. It's only 12 hours of classes, so I'm like, okay. Efficient and ethical economies, and offered extra credit for sending me an example from each quadrant with justification. And between that assignment and the class itself, we got great results. So one of the best examples was from Daniel Cortez, who was one of the ones who didn't have a great result on that specific result on the quiz, and ended up delivering an excellent case study on Star Wars Battlefront 2 2 weeks later. And if you're familiar with gaming history, this game is like a sea change in the monetization world of gaming, because they were one of the first really influential loot crates, and their loot crates had pay for power element to them. Like, you needed stuff, there was stuff in the loot crates you needed to win, and they were randomized, and it was, nobody liked it, right? If you want to meme that. And so they ended up shifting it to a pay to express model, where they got rid of the pay to win mechanics, and it was only cosmetics in the monetization. And so seeing the student like call that out so crisply for this class using the spectrum monetization was really great. And then like the assignments like, give me a summary of your case study, but it doesn't say like you have to come up with business strategy insights. Like, I was like, yes, preach, with this like lessons for business strategy at the end. Like, yes, align your business model with your player experience. Monetization that disrupts gameplay fairness does destroy brand equity faster than it generates revenue. Like, yes, absolutely, yes. And this slide, this is why I want us talking more about game monetization, because when I talk about the fact that there are monetization chapters in my book, many game designers are like, ew. And they bounce off to like, I don't want, it's my art, I don't want to do it. If you don't, the people who will exploit players will, right? And so the people who want to be people focused have to have these discussions and have to have the people these center people in monetization, because someone has to pay for the servers. And so let's do it in a sustainable way. That's what this is all about. So I loved seeing this slide with community feedback as a strategic signal. Live service requires long-term thinking. Yes, yes, yes. Another case study that came from the class this year was Sydney Hassel. It's profiled Wizard 101, which is another one where it's like, oh, wow, live service just been hanging out for 2 decades. And this one, I loved the graphic that she put together. It's totally, the Wizard 101 just sitting in the middle of the spectrum of monetization. She's like, it's got all of it. You know, you could buy cosmetics. There's a subscription. You could buy stuff that helps you with power, but like you can also, so there's all of these things. And there was some nuanced discussion about the effects of the paywall and stuff in there, and so it was really cool to see that nuanced discussion from students after a couple of hours in class. So if all of these topics interest you, there's lots more in the game development strategy guide. There's a whole chapter on user experience design and practice in games. There's a whole chapter on multiplayer models. There's a whole chapter on like the application of art and narrative in games, which is creative immersive worlds. There's a whole chapter on emergent behavior and how that translates into pro-social game design patterns. And if you'd like to get the book, there's a code Enduring Play S2 that's tied to my podcast, which you can use to get that on rosenfeldmedia.com. And there's also, for free, the podcast. That I'm having a lot of fun with the podcast as a companion to the book, exploring the motivators, diving into themes. And the first season of the podcast is the full interviews of 10 of the people I interviewed for the book. And so you just get like the full perspective, which is really great. And then the second season, I'm expanding on concepts like community and research and things that I didn't get as much time to cover in the actual book. And so this week's episode, for example, authentic games or cultural technical design, technical design's like an emergent field. I didn't get time to really cover it, but like as a person who hires user experience designers and designers, like this is one of the most unicorny sort of things in games. And so I'm talking to several technical designers this season to kind of explore that. And it's one of the things most unique to games. So some really cool discussions there. And so as a reminder, when you design for player motivation, your games are more likely to thrive. So with that, I can open up to questions and discussion for folks.
Go ahead and use the raise hand if you have a question for our author. I'm going to ask a question that's about UX and games. What is the one thing you wish UX people knew that game people all know?
One thing.
And then vice versa. Yeah, like
good
if
question.
only UX people would X.
I think the one thing I wish UX folks would understand is that how important, how to describe their own value
Mm,
to the games industry, right? Because that's basically what I've been called in to do several times as I come in and people are like, my user experience designers are just wireframers. Nobody's seeing our value. And like, it's not that these people are not talented. It's that they're having a hard time threading the needle and landing with the business. And so there's there's both the abstract and the game specific side of things, right? There's the abstract, which applies to any business, which is like, how do you take a field which is not, how do you get your seat at the table stuff, right? Like, how do you do stakeholder interviewing? How do you like basically turn our skills internally and build trust by applying UX to the team, and then use that to build it into the player facing part of the process. Like that was what I did at Riot. That was what I did at Scopely. And it's, if people don't understand what UX is, show them.
mm,
But then, uh, like within a few weeks after being at Riot, I was like running mission workshops for parts of our team on the player platform. And I'm like
mm,
and I'm like building little surveys to get the perspectives from everybody before going into a workshop. And I'm putting together Miro, and I'm like doing storyboarding with them. And I'm like, just, I'm showcasing the process. I'm building trust. It is all a little bit of a Trojan horse for like, hey, look what happens when we plan. Look what happens when we come together. Look what happens when we collaborate, build shared mental models of process. And within
mm,
6 months, I was getting invited to biz dev conversations
mm,
to give user experience perspective on contracts that hadn't been signed. That was like huge. And that was, when I interviewed there, they were like, UX is just wireframes. And so that is that journey. You
mm.
start by turning the skills internally and see how you can provide that support to, and I learned that a lot by my work at the Gates Foundation, which we totally didn't even talk about, right? But like there was a lot of organizational ethnography and a lot of, it was like, and so our skills are useful at the macro and the micro. And so if you're having trouble applying them at the macro, maybe there's a little bit at the micro. But then there's also understanding what places UX design thrives the most and drives the most value in games. And the place that I will, like, the hill I will die on is like, we have to teach people to play our games if we would like people to continue to play our games, because
Yeah,
gaming is a cycle and not
yeah,
everybody know, there's always new players.
yeah.
And what an honor it is to be the first RPG that someone plays. But you can only do that if you're the one who teaches them how to play RPGs.
Mm. We have questions. Do you want to unmute briefly and ask your question yourself?
Yeah, I guess edutainment has always been, something that every parent thinks they want to buy, and instead they buy first-person shooter 'em up games. Where do we go to get edutainment to be outrageously popular and profitable?
Edutainment to be outrageously popular and profitable? Interesting question. What could you? So, and it's interesting because there's a meta discussion right now on LinkedIn, and I think it was New York Times or something about education and games in general. So it's very timely, right? And to your point, my belief is going to be to point at the motivators. And in particular, my approach, like if you were to pull me into an edutainment company and say like, hey, we're struggling, I'd be like, okay, well, first thing is I want to do a listening tour with like your target audience, but both like the children and the parents, and just like hear how they game and hear what they do for leisure, and figure out like what motivates their play, and see what the gap is between what we're trying to do with our educational product and what they're doing. Like, are we being too stressful? Are we being social enough? Are we showing something that's worth mastering? Like, one of the examples I give in my book is like how on Disney Friends, like, there was a very gendered set of motivators, and we had to support both of them to really get full engagement from kids. And it's not so much about the gender as it is the difference in motivators, but understanding what's showing up for kids. Another thing is understanding the generational situation. Look, like, just point blank, in a world where kids can play with Minecraft and Roblox, anything that doesn't respond to you and let you self-express feels small. And so that is a high standard. And so meeting them where they are, going to those tools, giving them things that where they can learn by doing in many cases, or something that's really hands-on. Like I don't think that this generation is going to respond really well to like the old Encarta, like here's a like point and click thing where you just learn some stuff by looking at it. I think I see kids light up by doing things in Minecraft. And when I went to a talk at the GDC where the folks at Genshin Impact were talking about their user generated content launch, and they're like, yeah, someone built a neural network. And well, kids might not have done that. Like that's life finds a way, right? And so there's this spirit of building, and it's not going to work for every edutainment situation, right? But people find ways to teach themselves in constrained environments. So there's this good, probably for a lot of edutainment situations, there's a combination of creating the right constrained environment, the right pro-social patterns, and that creates the spirit of transcending over the obstacles to create magic. And so it's not a silver bullet, but hopefully that helps.
So why has it been so reluctant? I mean, this has really been a problem for the last 30 years that edutainment, we have Sims. I mean, we don't have a lot of edutainment blockbusters.
It's a hard one to answer briefly. I mean, it'd be hard to solve the whole industry problem. And I'm happy to like engage on LinkedIn or something offline. But like, I think there's a lot of if I'm being really blunt, if there's not a lot of money in it, you're not attracting the top talent, and so you're not getting into like the deeper questions, and so you're maybe not getting leading engagement on gameplay, which is not to say that you can only get great engagement with money, right? But up until this point, I think there's been like a disconnect. There's a great opportunity right now because a lot of people are out of work and there's a lot of great minds that need engagement. So if you want to get edutainment off the ground, now is the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Before Chris does, so apologies. I need to make clear that I am here speaking independently, but I am affiliated with the Pokemon International, so I'm unable to speak directly on Pokemon games.
Okay. So I guess maybe we can just make this a more general thing. Just a more general question of like, there's a whole thing about Club Penguin Island and how there was just much less user attachment because it went from a very free form, do whatever you want RPG, which was like a social RPG, to more of a constrained single player, we'll do missions kind of thing. And, similar things happen with, Pokemon with like Switch games and people saying, people don't like the Switch games and going back to an older product. And how do you kind of prevent that from happening? Because you said earlier that there is a lot of modernization and people need to have creativity, adding a bunch of self-expression things, but how do you do that without losing an essence or the soul of a game idea?
Well, it's going to be very subjective, right? Because this is an art. And I'm going to be frank with you too. Part of being a game developer is not making everybody happy. It's an art. And I literally will make free games and people will be angry that I'm not charging them for them. And so like literally. And so the first step is understanding that, and then understanding what you are trying to accomplish clearly, like having good goals. And so I want to say that because I can't tell you or any other company what is important to them. But what I can say is it does feel like we overinvest in our games, like we shoot past what is needed. A lot of players are telling us they need 10 hours, 20 hours. Do we need 100 hours? Do we need 200 hours? And then we're like, oh my God, well, the game's buggy because we made so much game. And everyone's like, I didn't need you to make 200 hours of game. I would have preferred 20 hours of very solid game. And that is on scoping. That is on understanding. And that gets back to me understanding why players play your game. A lot of times when you put 200 hours of game in there, it's because you don't actually know what the core of your game is. You are not confident enough in it. And so you spiral out of control. You put any good idea in there, you shoehorn that in. And that is why it was so important to me to put the motivators of play up front. I believe that you should not chase like everything, I believe you should choose a very good core loop, chase that and that alone, start small. And if you have a good core, you get to a sustainable business model where you can pay for the servers, then you can build out a little bit.
You know, it's also touched on something. There's sort of a tension in game design between having no scaffolding, the Mario 1.1 sort of approach where they're talking about the environment should tell you how to play, versus the more modern approach where there's lots of quests, lots of hints, lots of hand-holding. What do you think about where that should land?
Great
What
question.
works?
And like I mentioned before, the whole intentional friction thing can be very polarizing. And sometimes, and I'm going to be frank, I believe we should teach games, but that there are some game designers and some visions where they're like, no. Now, one way to view it is that, hey, accessibility matters, right? Teaching games is an accessibility play because not everybody has the same cognitive faculties. And so if you do not make teaching accessible, you have shut out people who are not engaging at the same level. So, okay, you don't want the game to lead with the teaching. Fine, make it an option. Make it opt out. Make it scalable. Build smart systems that only give you the teaching when you're struggling. The whole yellow paint problem is like when we're not being smart about it, we're just like adapting the world because we didn't know how to teach, right? So and that's a problem that's not unique to games. Like I had this problem in app design too, where I was like, hey folks, working on Alexa, working on Cortana, working on other apps. I'm like, we could do a much better job of proactive engagement with our customers if we were, there's all this big data. The only data I want is like what interactions were successful and which ones weren't successful, so I can just engage on the ones that weren't successful. Like that's the kind of like longitudinal data I want. But when I bring up those systems, they don't make money, and so like a lot of times, especially for existing games or products, we don't get them. And so what you get is either everybody thinks of teaching as a 2-hour first time player experience that's on rails and everybody has to go through. I'm not here for that either, right? Like I get it. People's brains get tired. There are lots of ways to teach. And there's also ways to use your community to teach, right? Pro-social design talks about giving players roles, greeters, like mentors, things like that. So there are other ways too. If you truly do not think that teaching in your game is part of it, there are ways to do that too.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have one in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and share your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl, for this talk. It's really interesting to hear about the motivators and how they change over time. I'm curious about the self-expression creativity one, and whether there are more like subsets that you see and maybe how those have changed. So the observation is that wanting to make aesthetic or visual changes feels very different to me than wanting to like build a tool or construct a narrative, an imaginary world. So I'm curious how you think about more like fine-grained distinctions within that. In part because some of these ones seem to intersect with like, if I want to build a tool, I kind of need more knowledge and there's a bit more problem solving involved as well. Do you see these interacting somehow?
I mean, it's kind of like personality types, right? Like there are certainly sub distinctions of these things. When you start getting into building tools and building things, it starts to become a mastery, self-expression combination in many cases. Like you're taking the language, you're taking the tool and showing people how good you are at the thing. Whereas like often cosmetics are generally more of just showing artistic, distinguishing oneself from others, right? Like pure self-expression is like, I am different, I matter, my time here matters, please see me for this unique self. Like it's interesting because like what you're essentially asking is like, what's the motivator for the motivators, right? Like what really get into it. And there's one which is that like demonstrate like craft and mastery, right? Like showing how like I am uniquely special and my work matters and my time matters. And then there's I can do something here that I can't do in the real world. A lot of self-expression in games is actually players doing things that doesn't match their real life persona. I talk about that a little bit with Adana Ned in episode 2 of season 2 of the podcast.
I got room
But
for one more question.
yeah. So there's there's talk about like people who have queer identities, like really exploring their self-expression that way. And so I think there's several strong sub motivators for self-expression in there for sure. And it all kind of manifests as people using tools to create their own world where it's safe to play, or create their own looks because they need to be somebody they can't in the real world.
Okay. So I want to pick up something because you mentioned very briefly about the Disney and the gendered play, and it wasn't what you thought. And I remember on another podcast I heard you talk about that. I was wondering if you would share that anecdote because I thought it was very interesting in the way it subverted stereotypes.
Absolutely, yeah. So Disney Friends DS was at the time, it was the biggest DS title that my studio Kryptonite Games had ever been working on. And it was Nintendogs plus Animal Crossing plus Disney characters at a time when before we walked so Dreamlight Valley could run, but we weren't allowed to cross the streams, this whole thing. So you were building a friendship with Stitch, TLDR. And we were play testing the alpha build with Stitch. So we had DS devices and a cartridge with early code that we brought to Los Angeles, California, and handed to children. And we wanted to see how the game played with them to make sure our core hypothesis that it was valuable to build a friendship with Stitch was correct. Well, and I always say like evaluate, not validate, right? So we wanted to test it, right? Like if there was something wrong, we wanted to find it. And what was really interesting was when we put it in front of kids. And the other thing you need to know is when you start to work with Disney, especially in this era, they're going to tell you Stitch is like catnip for boys. Like Stitch stuff flies off the shelves. Like it's Stitch in cars. Like Stitch is like hugely popular in this era. And so and Stitch came out in 2002, and this is like the year 2005. So we are not very far off that initial property. And so we bring this to Los Angeles, we give it to the kids. Stitch is like, and it's a little loop, so you can build a relationship. And if you do nice things to Stitch, he's friendly to you. If you do like, if you like poke him, or if you're not nice to him, he turns into naughty Stitch and he breaks the screen and he runs around and slimes all over everything. And you can give him toys and stuff like that. We survey the kids afterwards, and what we get back is the girls are like, I love this. I could do this forever. And the boys are like, I don't get it. And I was like, I'm the lead producer on this title, and I've been working on it since the beginning. And I have my lead designer, Amy, who I brought over from the entertainment technology work together. We meet together. We're like, are we terrible game designers? What have we done? Like, how did we break Stitch for boys? Like, but then we sat with it, right? Like we looked at because they had them like write surveys. It's like 6 to 8 year olds. Like we sat with like the tapes, we sat with things, and it was like, I don't understand what to do. And we sat there and we were like, could it just be the lack of mastery, right? Because the other piece of context is we wanted to be so immersive that we hacked the DS to do 3D on both screens. We didn't want to put menus in front of you. So there was 3D on both screens. We had like a trampoline, so Stitch could like jump up and down on both screens, right? And stuff. So there was just a clock. There was no menu telling you what to do. It was just be friends with Stitch. Use the pen, use the and you could speak to him. Like there was like there was like a little menu you could pull out the voice interactions, but like there was no goal. And so we're like, it couldn't be as simple as give you friendship points for doing nice things and putting a single goal meter up there for daily friendship points, could it? But we did that. We put nice little sparkles on there for doing the nice things with Stitch. And we put a daily friendship meter, just 1 meter up there, still 3D on 2 screens, daily friendship meter, brought it back to the kids. Girls still loved it. We hadn't changed that fundamental interaction. It was still an immersive friendship game. The boys were like, I could do this all day. And it's not about the genders, right? Like, because gender is a spectrum. It was just very, it was a different time. But it is about different motivators of play. They were coming at it from a mastery angle. They were at an age and a social position where they were trained to look for mastery-based experiences, and we were giving them nothing to master. The girls were socially socialized, right? So they knew exactly what to do. They're like, I will be nice to this creature, and it will give me love in return, and this is great.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're out of time, but I would love to just talk to you for hours about this. This is wonderful. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Lovely to thank you for the great questions.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.